Hello, I'm here to discuss the overview of analytical observational studies. At the end of the session, the students shall be able to identify the unique characteristics and salient features of analytical observational research studies. You will be able to illustrate the various general schemas of different epidemiological, analytical observational research designs. And lastly, you will be able to interpret the measures of association of analytical observational research studies. So the basic strategies of research in terms of the sequence of their development will be as follows. Often we first describe the nature of events by observing a defined population or an adequate representative sample. Then we generalize hypotheses of possible relationships or association from analysis of prevalence rates, frequency distributions, and other descriptive patterns in defined populations and subpopulations. Then we test hypotheses by comparison of frequencies of factors or conditions in different groups. And lastly, we formulate solutions or interventions based on findings of previous studies and testing of solutions by comparison of outcomes in both experimental and control groups. Now, epidemiology, as we have defined previously in the first few lectures, is concerned primarily with the distribution and determinants of health and diseases, morbidity, injuries, disability, and mortality in populations. Epidemiologic studies are applied to the control of health problems in populations. Now, among the principal uses of epidemiology, these would be the following. First, for purposes of historical use, community health use, for the provision of health services, for risk assessment use, and lastly, for disease causality use. If you recall from your previous lectures, we can dichotomize epidemiology into two broad categories. You have your descriptive epidemiology and you have your analytic epidemiology. Descriptive epidemiology, as a review, will be concerned in characterizing the amount and distribution of health and disease within a population. Health outcomes are classified according to person, place, and time variables. And descriptive studies aim to delineate the patterns and manners in which disease occurs in population. Sometimes people may have the same risk factors and yet they don't develop the same disease outcomes similarly. And this is why it is imperative that we are familiar with descriptive epidemiology. Descriptive epidemiology, in its strictest sense, will allow us to generate hypotheses of causation, which can set the stage for future and subsequent research that can examine and probe on the etiology of diseases. I want to be clear in stating that when we refer to causation, this is often um, the type of association that we want to establish. In terms of epidemiology, there could be various relationships among variables, but in particular for disease causation, we are really interested with association of risk factors and how they precipitate or how they can result in the development of overt disease outcomes. In contrast, analytic epidemiology would examine causal hypotheses regarding the association between exposures or risk factors and disease outcomes or health conditions. So again, let me reiterate, when I talk about causation, when we talk of association in analytic epidemiology, we often point to cause-effect relationships. Now, the field of analytic epidemiology proposes and evaluates causal models for etiologic associations and studies them empirically. In the next few weeks, you will be learning about the Bradford Hill criteria for disease causation or for causal inference. There are many criteria for causal inference, but the sine qua non, the criterion that really establishes cause effect relationship will be the criterion on temporality. When I say temporality, it always tells us that the cause precedes the effect. An analogy to this will be a horse and a carriage. When we talk of cause effect relationships, when we talk of the sine qua non, when we talk of the criterion of temporality for causal inference, the cause always precedes the effect. The horse will always come before the carriage and not the other way around. So when we talk of associations, this is what we are trying to investigate when we talk of epidemiologic studies that are analytical in design or analytical in nature. We are trying to establish whether or not there would be causal relationships between the exposure variables and the outcome variables. When I say exposure variables, often these are risk factors. On the other hand, when I say outcome variables, they are often diseases, medical conditions, or prognostic outcomes related to the disease. Now, you have learned that we can also dichotomize, or we can divide uh, classical epidemiologic research designs into two broad categories. You have your descriptive studies and you have your analytic studies. Under descriptive studies, things that we have previously looked into would include your case report and your case series, your correlational studies, and your cross-sectional studies. I am putting an asterisk for cross-sectional study because later on in my lecture, I will elaborate on why cross-sectional studies are very unique, wherein it can be purely descriptive in nature, or it can also be weakly analytical in design. And I will discuss that in a few minutes. Now, most of your descriptive studies are very useful for generating possible disease cause effect relationships between a risk factor and a disease outcome. So, when we talk of descriptive studies in general, they are used primarily for hypothesis generation. On the other hand, your analytical study designs can be divided into your observational and your experimental analytical studies. When we talk of observational analytical studies, we would just merely describe things and look into possible association of variables without any induced intervention. Once you prescribe a drug, once you recommend any treatment modality, let's say physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, any intervention that you try to introduce to your study subjects and or patient, that goes now to the realm of your experimental analytical study designs. Again, the main difference between your observational versus your experimental study designs would be for your experimental study designs, there would be an induced intervention. Observational study design merely look into the reality without any active intervention being done. And under these, you have the following. As I've said, you're cross-sectional in the hierarchy of epidemiologic study designs may be regarded as the weakest analytical study design. And later on, I will explain why it is viewed as the weakest analytical study design. Then you have your case control study and you have your cohort study. Your cohort study can be further divided into your concurrent cohort study and your non-concurrent cohort studies. All of your analytical study designs are most ideal in testing hypothesis of relationships, of cause-effect relationships. Now, moving forward, as I've said, we also have your experimental study designs, and this will be the topic of future lecture. of other future lectures. And this will now involve having an induced intervention. You introduce a specific treatment, a specific therapy. And again, just like any other experiment, just like any other analytical study design, they are considered ideal for hypothesis testing. In fact, your randomized controlled clinical trial is regarded as the gold standard in establishing or in testing hypothesis of causation. Now, there are various types of experimental study designs. Going through them very quickly, you have your randomized controlled trial, you have your field or your vaccine, or what we call your preventive trial, you have your community trial, and you have your non-randomized quasi-experimental trials, which would include your time series design or your crossover trials. They basically have the same general schema, but the main difference lies with the population of interest. Most randomized controlled clinical trials recruit sick individuals, while vaccine or preventive trials normally require healthy individuals. Community trials will employ study subjects based on a geographic location. That's why it's a community rather than individual patients. And your quasi-experimental trial often does not include randomization. And we will explain the concept of randomization in the future. Newer and modern epidemiologic research designs also venture into other clinical other study and other epidemiologic research study designs. And just going through very briefly, so again, in the let me retract my statement. If you're going to look at the hierarchy of things, this is how we would classically um, explain the various research design, looking into the wealth of robust epidemiological data. And that, as you go up across the spectrum, you would see that the gold standard would be your randomized controlled trials in terms of testing of your hypothesis of causation. Now, as I was mentioning earlier on, there are other study designs. If you pursue, let's say, master's degrees, if you pursue, let's say, Master of Science in Public Health, or if you go into residency training, perhaps, you will encounter other research study designs such as your systematic reviews, your meta-analysis, your supra-meta-analysis. If you venture into postgraduate course, let's say you do your MBA for health, if you do Masters of Science in Public Health, or if you pursue Masters in Health Administration, you might encounter other research designs such as for cost effectiveness, cost benefit, cost utilization, cost minimization analysis. If you're into health policy development, you might want to um, be aware with program evaluation or analysis. And recently, there is a change in trend wherein now we are looking into real world evidence, very similar to your randomized controlled clinical trial, but they are no longer very stringent in terms of study subject recruitment or in terms of the inclusion and exclusion criteria. When we go to higher epidemiologic subjects, perhaps in sophomore year, you would again see all of these study designs. But just to show you, our faculty members are also quite active in publishing in international research journals, various real world evidence. At the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, these are just some of the research publications of your faculty looking into the newer real world evidence studies. Then, if you are also pursuing, let's say, um, Masters in Health Science Education or Masters in Health Profession Education, or let's say you're doing other fields of endeavor related to clinical psychology, you might also be interested to learn that there are other research study designs now being recognized. We call them your qualitative studies. I believe you will have a lecture on the qualitative study designs in the future. I'm just giving you a heads up that I'm giving everyone the heads up that there are other research designs outside of the classical descriptive and analytical observational study design. So, since these are not discussed in detail in my lecture, I am just introducing the concept. Perhaps in the future, you will have more formal didactics on these research study designs. So, let's move now to the actual topic for this session, which will be your analytical observational study designs. And I want to begin with the case control study. When I talk of your case control studies, the investigator will choose one sample from a population of patients with an established outcome, meaning to say they're already diseased. I'm sorry, they have the disease, not diseased as in dead. They have the disease. I stand correct. I stand to correct myself. So when you have the disease or you are sick, you will be referred to as the cases. On the other hand, coming recruiting from a different population, we look for individuals who do not possess the disease, and therefore they are called the control. Now, the investigator will compare the distribution levels of the predictor variables or the exposure variables. Often these are risk factors for certain medical conditions, looking into both samples to see whether or not who will develop the outcome based on the presence or absence of the risk factor. For most risk factors, it is necessary to assemble a reference group so that the prevalence of the risk factor in the cases can be compared with the prevalence in the control. I'd like to review the topic on prevalence rate and incidence rate. Again, when I say prevalence rate, I am referring to the number of old and new cases for a particular disease in a given population at risk. In contrast, when I say incidence rate only refers to the number of new cases among populations at risk at the given point in time. So the difference between prevalence and prevalence rate would look into the number of new and old cases. Incidence rate focuses primarily on the new cases. When we talk of case control studies, they are very useful in identifying risk factors for certain diseases. The outcome traditionally used to determine case control status has been the presence or absence of the disease, and as mentioned previously, the term cases would often refer to those individuals with the disease already. However, the case control study design can only be used to look at other outcomes, such as the case control design can also be used to look at other outcomes, including disability among those who already have the disease. Sometimes, let's say, for example, you look into the number of patients, let's say amputees. If you're looking at amputees, those patients who've undergone above the knee or below the knee amputation, some of them may have prosthetics, some of them do not wish to have prosthetics or orthotics. So sometimes the quality of life of these individuals, of these people living with amputation, might differ if they have the prosthetic or the orthotic versus those who do not have the prosthetic or orthotic. So the population could be all amputees, but when we say case control, we can refer less if those with good quality of life versus poor quality of life. So it's not always disease per se. Classically, it is disease oriented, but we can also look into the disabilities if ever we choose to do so. Now, I mentioned to you earlier on that the sine qua non for cause effect relationship is how do we establish temporality? Temporality, if you will recall from what I've said earlier on, the cause always precedes the effect. For most observational analytical design, when we draw the general schema often highlights the temporality or the temporal profile of the study design. For example, you look at the present day situation. That is why on top, you will see the term the present. There are two circles that you can see here, indicating that there are two different populations. Among, let's say, those with a disease, you get a representation of those people who have the disease. So you sample, and then you look back in time or to the recent past to see whether or not those cases would possess a particular risk factor or they do not have that risk factor. In the same vein, you go to a different population, a population with no disease, and you also sample a representative set of controls. And you also go back in time to probe on whether or not these controls possess the risk factor or not. So when I talk of your general schema of a case control study, this is how we want you to draw the general schema. It is always retrospective in design. You start at the present situation, looking into the presence or absence of the disease. Then you go back in time to see whether or not your cases or your controls will possess the risk factor of interest. Now, the design of a case control study is challenging because of increased opportunities for bias. But there are many examples of well-designed case control studies that have yielded important results. Now, bias and confounders will be further elaborated on when you go to sophomore year during the next academic school year. However, just for purposes of our discussion today, let me introduce the concept of bias. Bias is synonymous to your systematic errors. Systematic errors tend to shift the relationship of the factors, the exposure variable and the disease or the outcome variable in one direction. When we talk of bias or errors rather, when we talk of errors in research, we can dichotomize them into your random error and your systematic error. Random error is a wrong result due to chance, due to unfortunate circumstances, and because this variation can equally distort measurements of both the exposure and the outcome variable, a random error can shift the relationship of the exposure or the outcome variable in either direction. It can make the true relationship stronger, or it could make the true relationship weaker to a certain degree. That's your random non-differential error. In contrast, when I talk of systematic errors is synonymous, systematic errors are synonymous to bias. When I say bias, if this is the true relationship, it will always move the relationship towards one direction only. It will make the relationship stronger always, or it will make the relationship weaker always. So that's the difference between your random error due to chance and your systematic error due to bias. Random error can move the direction of relationship in either direction, but for your systematic error, it only moves the direction of relationship towards one um, side only. Now, most case control studies are prone to systematic errors and bias, but hindi naman lahat. not all, but in general, they are prone to create or to possess bias. And when I talk of bias, we can dichotomize them into your selection bias or information bias. In general, when I say selection bias would look into the way we recruit study subjects to participate in our study, while information bias would pertain to errors that look into the way we gather information, whether we look into data collection process related to your exposure or your outcome variable. So again, biases in general, which are systematic errors, can be divided into your selection bias or your information bias. Again, please do not get overwhelmed. The concept of bias and errors will be further discussed in sophomore year, but for purposes of understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your observational analytical study designs, I am just giving you an overview of what bias and errors are all about. Again, errors are divided into your systematic and your random errors. Random errors are due to chance, and so it can shift the relationship in either direction. Systematic errors are called bias, and your bias always modifies the relationship towards one direction only. And your biases can be divided into your selection bias, or the way we recruit our study subjects, and the information bias, the way we gather information relative or pertinent um, to both your exposure and your outcome variables. Among the most commonly encountered biases in case control studies would be the way we interpret the results. In general, bias is any deviation in the collection, analysis, interpretation, and publication of data leading to conclusions that can systematically underestimate or overestimate the true relationship between a given exposure and a specific disease or any other outcomes. For most case control studies, under selection bias, we most encounter Bergsonian bias, while for information bias, we often encounter recall bias. Bergsonian bias, just to give you an overview, would look into the way we identify cases and control. Remember, your cases and control come from two different populations. If you recall the general schema that I presented earlier on, there were two circles suggestive that there are two populations. If, let's say, in a case control study, you recruit your controls, let's say, in a hospital setting, and you recruit your controls from the community setting, of course, you would expect those cases who come from the hospital would present with severe or more debilitating disease states already, in contrast to those who are still in the community, in their homes, not warranting hospitalization. The type of data that you may gather can affect the way you recruit your study subjects, because in a case control study, you are recruiting study subjects from two different populations. The requirement of a case control study only looks into the representativeness of the cases and the controls. Your cases must truly be representative of the cases in general, while your controls must be representative of the controls in general. Because they come from two different populations, this is where Bergsonian fallacy or Bergsonian bias may be introduced. For academic purposes, I want the freshmen to do further reading on Bergsonian bias. Recall bias, on the other hand, tends to rely on the ability of your respondents or your study subjects to remember previous events. Remember, if you recall, once again, in the general schema, there is a temporal relationship. From the present situation, we go back in time to the past. And sometimes we probe on risk factors that have been evident, let's say 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. If you are asked to remember things that happened in the past, the process of recovery or memory can impact on the recall ability of your patient. And that is what we refer to in simplest form, the recall bias. Now, bias or your systematic errors cannot be minimized by increasing the sample size. Sample size estimation or manipulation of your sample size often becomes useful if you want to address or correct random errors, but not systematic errors or not your bias. Case control studies cannot yield estimates of incidence or prevalence because the proportion of study subjects who have the disease is determined by how many cases and how many controls the investigator chooses to sample rather than by their proportions in their population. So again, the concept of incidence and prevalence is being implicated again in the concept of case control studies. Just to reiterate what I've mentioned earlier on, prevalence refers to the number of old and new cases, while incidence rate only reflect the new cases of a disease and can be reported as a risk or as an incidence rate. So, unfortunately, your case control studies, one of their weaknesses is that there is no ability to estimate incidence rate or prevalence rate of a disease. Case control studies, however, provide descriptive information on the characteristics of the cases and, more importantly, an estimate of the strength of association. Again, when I talk of association, I am hinting on cause effect relationship. When we talk of the strength of association, this refers to the odds ratio. And this is your 2 by 2 contingency table. Whether or not you're dealing with a case control study or a cohort study or a cross sectional study that is analytical in nature, you can always come up with your 2 by 2 contingency table. On the x-axis on the top, you always have the presence or absence of the outcome, while on the y-axis or on the vertical axis rather, you have the presence or absence of the risk factor or the exposure variable. So if in any 2 by 2 table we present, let's say in the exam, we show you a 2 by 2 table, and let's say we deliberately manipulated the 2 by 2 table, please make sure that you are able to reconstruct the correct 2 by 2 table so that you will be able to determine with accuracy the needed measure of association. So if this is your 2 by 2 table, you get the information from your results of the paper or the research, and then you tabulate it into A, B, C, or D. In a case control study, the main measure of association would be your odds ratio. And your odds ratio from the 2 by 2 table is derived as such. It is the quotient of AD over BC. And how do we interpret the odds ratio? The value of null or the value of no relationship is 1. So if your odds ratio is equal to 1, your risk factor is not related to the disease. If your odds ratio is greater than 1, the risk factor is positively related to the disease. And if your odds ratio is less than 1, your risk factor is negatively related to the disease. If you compare your odds ratio with the measure of relationship, let's say in a correlational ecologic study, Remember, let's go back to our previous lesson. In a correlational study, the odds, the main measure of relationship would be your Spearman's Law or your Pearson's R. Your Spearman's Law is the measure of correlation if you're talking of data that are non-normal in distribution. Your Pearson's R, on the other hand, is the main measure of correlation if your data are normally distributed. If you look at the Spearman's Law and you look at the Pearson's R, its value of null is zero because rho of equal to zero or R equal to zero tells us that there is no correlation. So if you look at Pearson's R or Spearman's Law, the measure of null is zero. So when we look at statistical significance in the future, when you go to biostatistics, if you look at the 95% confidence interval, for the measure of relationship to be statistically significant, you look at the 95% confidence interval, and that interval should not contain the value of null. For Pearson's R and Spearman's Law, the value of null is zero. But for your odds ratio, the value of null is 1. So in the future, aside from looking at the magnitude or the strength of the measure of association, your odds ratio can be determined to be statistically significant if the p-value is less than 0.05 or if the 95% confidence interval does not include 1, because the OR and the value of null for an OR or for the odds ratio is 1. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of your case control studies? One of the major strengths is that they have the ability to yield information even from just a relatively few subjects. If the disease outcome happens to be rare, or if your disease outcome tends to have a long latent period to be overtly notable, then your case control study would be very good. And of course, it has a retrospective approach. And so this is very useful for generating hypotheses about the causes of a new outbreak of disease. So in terms of outbreak investigation, one of the most commonly employed study designs will be your case control study. Again, they also have limitations. I've already mentioned that there is no ability for a case control study to estimate incidence or prevalence or even excess risk associated with the variables of interest. And because you only start with one disease outcome at the very beginning, you only can analyze one outcome at a single point in time. Of course, they're also susceptible to bias. I've already mentioned this earlier on. I want to give you a classical example of how a case control study was utilized to establish cause-effect relationship. During the 1950s and 60s, so during the 1950s and 60s, a new drug was introduced, the diethylstilbestrol tablets. This was initially used for hyperemesis gravidarum, for premature contraction that can precipitate premature labor or even spontaneous abortion. So initially, it was being promoted for that particular indication. However, over the years, they noted that the use of in the 1970s, they were able to link women who used diethylesterol tablets, what do you call it again? Sorry, diethylstilbestrol or your DES. women who were using DES developed cervical cancer, cervical and vaginal cancer, a rare type, which we call your clear cell adenocarcinoma. And because of this, the US FDA eventually notified doctors that DES should not be prescribed to pregnant women, to the point that even the warning reached the European countries. And in 1978, the popularity of DES started to decline because of the link of DES exposure to your clear cell adenocarcinoma. So this is an example of that rare type of uh, gynecologic malignancy. Now, because of the study, they were also able to determine that, let's say, for example, for the women who used DES, years later, even their daughters, which the epidemiologists referred to as the DES daughters, they also had higher risk of developing clear cell adenocarcinoma, even if they were no longer taking the DES. And the exposure started from their mother's use of of the DES previously. And so if you look at this, they were able to conclude based on the odds ratio that women who had clear cell adenocarcinoma had 40 times higher odds that their mother had exposure pre-pregnancy to deaths. So let me look into the way the epidemiologists concluded their findings. In a case control study, they begin with the presence or absence of clear cell carcinoma among the DES daughters. That is why when you phrase your conclusion, you always begin with the presence or absence of the disease. Because if you look at the way study subject recruitment is done in a case control study, you always begin with the recruitment of study subjects based on the presence or absence of the disease. And then you use the odds ratio to link it with the exposure variable. That is why, if you look at the conclusion of the authors, they said among DES daughters with clear cell adenocarcinoma of the lower genital tract, they begin with the outcome. There were 40 times higher odds that their mother had prenatal exposure to DES, and that is the exposure variable. So that is why we now have a lot of studies linking into medication use in terms of safety profile, not only for the growing fetus, but even for the mother. Let's say if they will be lactating, can you pass on drugs in breast milk? Most of the studies that are now related to maternal safety or pregnancy related safety profile of drugs can be linked to this landmark study looking into the link of pregnancy or pre-pregnancy exposure to drugs and even malignancy, not only in the patients themselves, but even to their offsprings, to their daughters in the future. So that is your case control study. We now move to your cohort study. Your cohort study looks now into a group of individuals or a cohort that you follow up in time. Remember, the sine qua non for your causal relationship or causal inference is temporality. The cause precedes the effect. There are two primary purposes for doing your cohort study. You can first describe the occurrence of certain outcomes over time, and you can analyze associations between predictors and those outcomes. Let me emphasize, when I talk of association, I am referring to cause-effect relationship. Now, we divide your two cohort designs into either being prospective or concurrent, or your non-concurrent are your retrospective designs. In older epidemiologic textbooks, we refer to them as your prospective and your retrospective cohort studies. However, in a short while, I will explain why we are already shying away from the use of the terminology retrospective versus prospective because, in truth, your non concurrent cohort is not retrospective in design. But older textbooks would recall this your retrospective study designs. If you get the palindrome of cohort or you twist the word, it now spells out as Trohawk. In other textbooks, your non-concurrent cohort is also referred to as your Trohawk study. It's a palindrome of the word cohort. Now let's talk about your concurrent cohort or your prospective cohort. Here, instead of recruiting study subjects based on the presence or absence of the disease, just like in a case control study, remember case control. Cases you have the disease, control you don't have the disease. And it is retrospective in design. For a cohort study, you recruit subjects based on the presence or absence of the risk factor. The investigator measures characteristics in each study subject that might predict the subsequent outcomes, and therefore, these subjects are followed up in time to determine whether or not they will develop the outcome of interest. The design is a powerful strategy for assessing incidence rate, the ability to develop the new onset disease. Remember, incidence rate looks into the number of new cases, newly diagnosed patients. And so, measuring the levels of predictor before the outcome occurs can establish the true temporality, the true time sequence of the variables, and therefore it can prevent the predictor measures from being influenced by knowledge of the outcome. All cohort studies share the general disadvantage of observational study designs that causal inferences would be challenging because there could be the power of confounding variables. A confounding variable will also be discussed in the future when you go to sophomore year under the lecture bias and confounders. When I talk of confounding variable, I just want you to think of the analogy that when you look at dependent and independent variables, your independent variable or your exposure variable and your dependent variable, your outcome variable. We are interested with that relationship, independent exposure variable, dependent, and your outcome variable. But sometimes there is a third extraneous variable that can influence both the independent variable and the outcome variable. And that is what we refer to as your confounding variable. Another thing is that most cohort studies, because you follow them up in time, they are quite expensive. And so if you are looking for a rare outcome, it's not advisable to use this study design. Cohort studies, on the other hand, would be good if you're looking at the rare exposure variable. So this is now the general schema of a concurrent cohort study. Look at the time profile now. Look at the temporality. From the present, we now go to the future. Remember, in a case control study, at present, you go back in time. In a cohort study, you begin with the present and then you follow up your patient going to the future to see who among them will develop the disease and who will not develop the disease. But be mindful of the subtle differences in the general schema. Look at the general schema. You only have one population, meaning to say, those patients that you recruit will be similar in all characteristics. They would be comparable in all features. in all social demographic profiles except for the presence or absence of the risk factor. For example, you want to establish the relationship of vape use and the development of bronchogenic carcinoma after 20 years. If you recruit your study subjects, you recruit them from one population only. For example, among UERM students only, hindi pa pwede kayong kumuha, let's say, ng Ateneo students or UP College of Medicine students or UST Faculty of Medicine and Faculty of Medicine Surgery students. Talagang one population lang, UERM College of Medicine students. That's what we mean with only one circle. And you recruit medical students from UERM. As much as possible, you recruit study subjects who have similar age profile, similar economic status, similar educational background, similar family structure. The only difference, may nagvi-vape, hindi nagvi-vape. That's what we mean that you only have one population and your study subjects are comparable in profile, except for the presence or absence of the risk factor. And then you follow them up in time, let's say from 2026 all the way to 2040. Titignan mo who among the medical students will develop, among the vape users, the UERM medical students, who will develop bronchogenic carcinoma in 2040, who will not develop bronchogenic carcinoma in 2040. Or among the vape users, sino ang may cancer at walang cancer? Among the non-vape users, sino ang may cancer, walang cancer by the year 2040? That's what we mean by a cohort study that is prospective and designed or concurrent in nature. Now look at now your non-concurring cohort. Let me reiterate, the term retrospective is a misnomer. In older textbooks, this is what we call it, your retrospective cohort. Now we utilize your non-concurring cohort if you are looking data that might require historical exposure. This type of study is only possible if adequate data about the risk factors and outcomes are available only on a cohort of subject that has been previously assembled for other purposes. Look at this. It's the same concept. The only difference is instead of from the present going to the future, you already recruit subjects based on the presence or absence of the risk factor that happened in the past, not something that happened currently. But notice that it is still forward looking from the past going to the present. So you are not interested with ano ba yung may sakit ba sila ngayon or wala. But what you are interested in is that the exposure happened in the past. For example, you want to determine whether exposure to volcanic ash to Mount Taal would exacerbate asthma. When was the last documented yung talagang major explosion of Mount Taal? That was in 2020. In particular, if I remember history correctly, it was in January 2020 when Mount Taal had the massive eruption. So the exposure will be those subjects who were exposed to volcanic ash in January 2020 versus those who were not exposed to the volcanic ash in 2020. So the exposure is historical. And then you recruit them based on that absence or presence of volcanic ash exposure. And then you look at them today. How many of these people now have severe asthma or uncontrolled asthma? That's what we mean by your non-concurrent cohort. It is not truly retrospective in design because the temporality or the temporal profile is still forward looking from the past going to the present. It is not retrospective, just like your case control study. But be mindful that just like your concurrent cohort, it only has a single population, and your study subjects must be comparable in all profile and all social demographic characteristics, except for the presence or absence of the exposure variable or the risk factor. Your non-concurrent cohort is definitely, it will definitely possess the same strengths as your concurrent cohort, and often it is less time consuming and less costly in terms of study implementation. Now, the main disadvantage will be the limited control that the investigator has over the population, um, and over the nature and quality of the predictor variables. Existing data may be incomplete, inaccurate, or measured in ways that are not ideal for answering the current research question. Now, again, the cohort study has a hallmark feature, and this is the period of follow up. You go forward in time to see how many of these subjects will develop the outcome of interest. Let me reiterate that the principal requirement of a cohort study is the comparability of the study subjects, meaning to say, in terms of social demographic profile or medical profile, they are very much the same, except for the presence or absence of the risk factor being studied. And because there is a need for follow up, this is often forward looking in time. There may be the issue of attrition or loss to follow up. And when you follow up your patients or your study subjects, any result that can be generalized to your bigger population. Remember, your research will focuses on study subjects who were recruited primarily for your study subject, for your study, research study. It has to be generalizable to the bigger population it represents. So generalizability also refers to your external validity. And of course, when you go to statistics, you would need to learn that the number of study subjects to be recruited for a cohort study must yield adequate power as well. Now, the quality of the cohort study will depend on the precision and accuracy of measurements of predictor and outcome. So again, I'm not sure if you will recall, no, but a few weeks ago we also had the lecture on precision and accuracy. This will also be discussed in brief later on when we go to cohort to cross-sectional studies. Cohort studies are also subject to a lot of pitfalls, including your potential confounding variables and sources of effect modification. Again, these uh, research method concepts will be further discussed in future lectures on bias and confounders when you go to sophomore year. Predictor variables may change during the study, and so the concept of using standardized criteria and employing blinding is something that you will also need to learn when we deal with cohort studies. But again, we will reserve the discussion on blinding processes for future discussions. As I mentioned, follow-up is very important. And so because this is prospective in nature, especially your concurrent cohort, attrition rate may be seen in patients, especially if the period of observation would require several years. So whenever there would be significant attrition rate, we will talk about loss to follow-up or dropout rates or attrition rates in the future. But just be mindful that in general, we have an arbitrary value of 20% and below as acceptable. So if your dropout rate exceeds 20% of your total number of recruited subject, and by the end of your observation period, your attrition is beyond 20%, then that is already a significant loss to follow up, a significant attrition rate, a significant dropout rate for which statistical manipulation would be imperative to address the burden of attrition rate. But again, we will discuss this in future lectures when you go to higher courses. So again, we focus our attention to your 2 by 2 table. And just like your uh, case control study where you have your odds ratio, the main measure of association for your cohort study would be your relative risk or your risk ratio. The relative risk or the risk ratio is the quotient of the risk among the exposed divided by the risk among the unexposed. And from the 2 by 2 table, this is how you generate your relative risk or your risk ratio. And again, the value of null is 1. If your relative risk or your risk ratio is greater than 1, then this is positively associated with the disease. On the other hand, if your relative risk or your risk ratio for a while, okay, I apologize. I was distracted. Let me go back. Okay, oops, sorry. So in the cohort study, one of the more popular utilization of your cohort study is perhaps the Framingham Heart Study. The Framingham Heart Study was used to identify the common factors or characteristics that contribute to cardiovascular diseases by following its development over a long period of time in a large group of participants who had not yet developed overt symptoms of cardiovascular disease or have not yet suffered a major acute coronary event, including a heart attack or a brain attack or your stroke. So because of the period of observation, it started from the 1940s and up to this day, there are cohorts of your Framingham. We are now able to come up with a myriad of recommendations for the disease prevention and control of your cardiovascular outcomes or your cardiovascular diseases. So it all emanated from the studies starting from the 1940s, which we call your cohort. Just to summarize, from 1940s all the way to the 2010s, the people were followed up in time looking into their risk factors. And this is why we now identify disease outcomes, including hypertension, dyslipidemia, ischemic heart disease, or your chronic coronary syndrome, acute coronary syndrome, atherosclerosis, among other things. To the point that even their filial generations were also included in the study because the period of observation continued until this day. So in 1994, the first Omni cohort was enrolled, and then in 2002, the third generation or the grandchildren of the original cohort was included. Then in 2003, the second group of Omni participants was also enrolled. And just to summarize, just to give you an idea, from the 19 from the from 1948, when the framing heart study was first implemented up until the 2010s, we were able to look at all of these developments with regard to cardiovascular diseases. Everything that we know now about cardiovascular, or majority of what we know now about cardiovascular disease prevention and control, emanated from whatever studies that were initiated back in 1948 at the start of the Framingham Heart Study. Then the last study designed for this session would be your cross-sectional study. As I've mentioned earlier on, your cross-sectional study is a very unique study design because it can be purely descriptive in nature, or it could be regarded as the weakest observational analytical study design. Cross-sectional studies would involve the collection of information on the presence or level of one or more variables of interest, whether exposure or outcome as they exist in a defined population at one particular point or one particular period of time. If these data are analyzed only to determine the variables, to determine the distribution of one or more variables, then we can categorically say it is purely descriptive in design. However, in cross-sectional studies, the investigators can also assess potential cause-effect relationships. And this now becomes your analytical cross-sectional study. When we say it's purely descriptive cross-sectional study, it provides a snapshot of the frequency and characteristics of disease in a population at a particular period in time or point in time. This is very ideal in establishing prevalence of disease or identifying risk factors in a population. Ergo, they are very relevant in assessing public health diseases diseases that are of public health burden. And this is also where health policy development uh, can also begin. For example, if you do a simple survey, let's say this one, a population-based cross-sectional study on the status of diabetes care in the Philippines. This was published in 2020. It is merely um it is merely a descriptive survey. So one of our co-authors is our department chair, Dr. Wangpa. So you can see this has been published in an international publication as well. So if you are merely interested with determining burden of disease, then that's purely a descriptive cross-sectional survey. Even your future community diagnosis, when you visit San Juan and you do home interviews, you are actually doing a descriptive survey, a descriptive population-based cross-sectional study. In contrast, once you try to link risk factors with possible disease outcomes, then that becomes an analytical study design. You are not only looking into the distribution of variables within a population, but you are looking into what could potentially be predictors or risk factors and outcome variables. And because you analyze the variables at a single point or a single period in time, that disease, that cause effect relationship, the hypothesis will rely primarily on biologic plausibility and information regarding possible causal relationship coming from other sources. Analytical cross-sectional studies can be used for examining association. And again, your cause-effect hypothesis would rely or would bank on what previous existing information the investigator would have. This choice is easy for constitutional factors, including age and race, and these cannot be altered by other variables and their other predictors. However, the choice can go either way. Parang when we talk of analytical cross-sectional studies, which came first, the chicken or the egg? It's hard to argue which came first, but based on the hypothesis of the investigator as what he or she would ascertain as the exposure variable and what would be the outcome variable, then that would be acceptable provided it is compatible with existing knowledge or it adheres with current level of understanding of things. Unlike cohort studies, which you can establish incidence, cross-sectional studies can only yield data on prevalence. So we can only measure prevalence, not incidence, in your cross-sectional study. Why? Because everything is analyzed at a single point in time. Wala siyang temporal relationship, only present day situation lang. It could be a present period of time, let's say from January to December 2025 or simply February 25, 2026. Ganun lang. Point a single period in time, again, January 2025 to December 2025, or a single point in time. For example, February 25, 2026, a day wherein we are celebrating the EDSA People Power Revolution. Its 40th anniversary today. So that's what we mean by single point in time, single period in time, because you're analyzing it in that temporal dimension. We cannot yield incidence, only prevalence. Prevalence is useful to health practitioners who want to know how many people have certain diseases so they can allocate enough resources to care for them. And it is useful to the clinician who must estimate the likelihood that the patient sitting in their offices has a particular disease. So, when analyzing cross-sectional study, we always put the word prevalence because to remind us that it is a cross-sectional study. The prevalence of the outcome is compared among those with or without exposure, giving relative prevalence of the outcome, and therefore, this is what we refer to as the equivalent of your relative risk. So in cross-sectional study, we can utilize either the prevalence risk ratio, similar to that of your cohort study, and your prevalence odds ratio, which is similar to your case control study. Again, we put the word prevalence at the start to remind us that this is a cross-sectional study. So you have your prevalence risk ratio and your prevalence odds ratio. So again, if you look at the general schema of your cross-sectional study, notice that there is no time element. In the case control study, we had the present going to the past. In a cohort study, that is concurrent from the present going to the future. But in a cross-sectional study, because everything is analyzed at a single point or a single period in time, there is no temporal relationship established. But notice you have a single population, one circle, wherein you recruit people and you analyze the presence or absence of the outcome together with the presence or absence of the exposure variable simultaneously with the presence or absence of the outcome variable at a single point or a single period in time. This is the general schema of an analytical cross-sectional study design. Again, you have your 2 by 2 table. From here, you can use either the prevalence risk ratio or the relative prevalence, or we can use the prevalence odds ratio. Notice that the calculation or the formulae are the same as that of your odds ratio for a case control study and your relative risk or your risk ratio for your cohort study. So when do you use your PRR? When do you use your POR? If your PRRs, if the outcome variable, let me correct myself, if the outcome variable of your cross-sectional study is an acute illness, then this is when you use your PRR. On the other hand, if the outcome variable of your disease, of your cross-sectional study is a chronic condition or if it's a non-disease state, then that's when you use your prevalence odds ratio. So for example, you want to determine the outcome variable, let's say, is COVID-19. COVID-19 is an acute infection. So if the outcome of interest is COVID-19, then you use your PRR. If the outcome of interest, let's say breast cancer, it develops over a prolonged period of time, or let's say poor quality of life, it's a non-disease state, or high level of burnout, it's a non-disease state, then we use your prevalence odds ratio. And just like in the past, we also interpret them the same, no? The way we interpret the odds ratio, the way we interpret your relative risk or your risk ratio, the same interpretation for your prevalence odds ratio and your prevalence risk ratio. An advantage of doing an analytical cross-sectional study, there's no waiting time because the variables are all analyzed at a single point in time or a single period in time. It is fast and inexpensive and there is no attrition rate. However, there could be difficulty with really establishing cause-effect relationship. Hence, it is the weakest analytical study design because the relationship banks on the theory or the hypothesis of the investigator relying on existing fund of knowledge, existing current level of understanding of things. It does not possess the sine qua non of causal inference, which is your temporality. Walang temporal relationship, walang time factor, no temporal relationship in an analytical cross-sectional study design, and ergo it is considered the weakest analytical study design. It is also impractical for studying rare medical conditions. So again, just to highlight, no, if it's purely just research on surveys, it's a descriptive study design. But once you link it with other variables, let's say, for example, finding the link between knowledge, attitude, and practices, and let's say self efficacy or self care practices, there is now potential association. Then it becomes analytical and study design. Now, we also want to give a review of what we've discussed previously. When we talk of the diagnostic tests, in previous lectures, we've talked about already some of the concepts of sensitivity, specificity, positive, negative, predictive values. These are all determined, no, in utilizing cross-sectional studies. In newer textbooks, they are referred to as diagnostic trials. But if you follow JAMA or the journal for most medical specialties in the Americas, um, when you look into the accuracy or of a diagnostic test, it is often classified just a merely classified as a cross-sectional study. I just wanted to expound or further deepen the understanding for cross-sectional studies that utilize diagnostic trials in analysis. Aside from determining sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive and negative predictive values, there are also concepts related to cross-sectional studies, in particular, your ROC curves, as well as your likelihood ratios. And just a review, when we talk of accuracy and precision, this has been discussed in previous lectures. This is just a review for everyone. This is how we illustrate the concept of accuracy and precision. And we have discussed previously already sensitivity, true positives, false negative error rates, as well as specificity and positive error rates. I just wanted to highlight that aside from from these, including the predictive values, we can also, I want to reiterate, so your sensitivity and specificities are inherent characteristics of the diagnostic tests. They are not influenced by the prevalence of the disease, unlike your predictive values, which are dependent or influenced by the prevalence of the disease. In your cross-sectional study, we've already highlighted your 2 by 2 table, and in the previous lecture, we also identified what will be your true positives, your true negatives, as well as your false positives and false negatives. And we have also elaborated already on these concepts previously. But I want to go further and discuss your likelihood ratios. We divide your likelihood ratios. Excuse me. We divide your likelihood ratios into your LR positive and your LR negative. Your LR positive can be derived using this formula. And you also have your negative likelihood ratio or your LR negative, which is derived with this formula. Now, this is important to ascertain also the ability of your test. When you go to evidence-based medicine in third year, I want you to remember that there is a concept of your likelihood ratio when you do critical appraisal of you using the user's guide for diagnostic tests. So this is very pertinent for third year med school, but I even for clinical clerkship and residency. That is why I want to make sure that I introduce the concept of your LR positive and your LR negative in a cross-sectional study design. In brief, you may also encounter future journals that look into your receiver operating characteristic or ROC curve. This is used to assess the overall diagnostic performance of a test to compare the performance of two or more diagnostic tests. In essence, it is used to select an optimal cutoff value for determining the presence or absence of the disease. And in this plot, you will see how the ROC curve would tell us more or less if your diagnostic test will be very useful. This is something that we utilize in terms of determining the ability of your diagnostic test um, in truly identifying the disease that is being measured. For a diagnostic test to be meaningful, the AUC or the area under the curve must be greater than 0.05, and generally an AUC of greater than or equal to zero point 0.8 is considered acceptable. So sometimes you may be shown an ROC curve, and if you are to interpret the ROC curve, just to show you that this is how we would more or less gauge if a new diagnostic test would be useful or not in the diagnosis of a medical condition. This is again similar to a cross-sectional study. I'm putting it here because in futures, when you go to evidence-based medicine in third year, clinical clerkship, or even postgraduate internship, even during residency or fellowship, I hope this will guide you on how to understand the AUC or the area under the curve. So just to give you examples, no, this was highlighted several weeks ago in the previous lectures. What would be the characteristics of an ideal screening test versus that of a confirmatory test? And from this study, for example, you would see that they present an ROC curve, so you will have an idea of how to interpret this if you just see a graph plotted in the journal. So, in summary, what have we discussed for today? We have gone through the different observational analytical study designs. I hope I was able to highlight its uses, the salient features, and what measures of association would be needed to really ascertain cause-effect relationships. So, case control studies, in this design, the prevalence of risk factors in a sample of subjects considered the cases will be compared to those of the controls. This design is relatively inexpensive and uniquely efficient for studying rare disease, and its main measure of association would be the odds ratio. However, because of its retrospective design, it is subject to recall bias, and there could also be issues pertaining to sampling bias, including the Bergsonian fallacy. Cohort studies are further divided into your concurrent and your non-concurrent cohort, wherein you recruit study subjects based on the presence or absence of risk factors. They are followed up in time to see how many of them will develop the disease of interest. So this will establish incidence. However, there could be issues also with the temporality because it is forward looking. There could be issues with attrition, or there could be other forms of systematic errors. And in a cohort study, we can yield the risk ratio or the relative risk as the main measure of association. And then lastly, we look into the cross-sectional study, which is unique, wherein it could be purely descriptive in design if this is something that would be just a survey, or it could be weakly analytical, wherein we look into the prevalence of disease and we analyze the variables measured at a single point or a single period in time. And they often yield the lowest level of causality because it has no temporality, the sine qua non for establishing causal relationship. And often analytical cross-sectional studies would employ a very large sample size. And we also looked again, we reviewed the diagnostic accuracy of tests in everyday clinical practice. We had a review on sensitivity, specificity, predictive values, likelihood ratios, as well as your ROC for future use when it comes to evidence-based medicine. So again, just to highlight the temporality, temporality is the sine qua non for establishing cause-effect relationships. And just to highlight some of the advantages and disadvantages of the various designs used in clinical epidemiology. If you want to do further reading, and I would highly recommend you do supplemental reading, because it will be impossible for me to discuss everything in detail. As I've said, this is just an overview. If you go to the research section of the medical library, these are two student-friendly textbooks that you can read. I highly encourage that you go over them because it will give you a better understanding of whatever I have discussed for this session. And with this, I want to thank you for your kind attention. If you have any inquiries or if you have any questions, you can email me and I will try my very best to answer your inquiries the soonest possible time. With that, thank you and good day to everyone.